For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Shomolikai, Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa Chief Economist and author Wandile Sihlobo, and University of Stellenbosch Professor and Director of the Bureau for Economic Research, Johann Kirsten, joined me to unpack their co-authored book titled The Uncomfortable Truth About South Africa's Agriculture. Your book explores ways to fully unlock the country's cultural potential. So, how significant is the growth potential for South African agriculture?
Look, maybe I may start and then Prof will jump in here, which is why are we having this discussion and why agriculture is always so topical and the arguments that we advance in the book. And I think it all starts and is a continuation of a number of works that we have been in our previous text, the conversation, and various aspects that we have been touching on. But what we have realized, the tone of it is very different from what we have written in the past. And the whole aspect of it is about bringing in the urgency as to why are we not progressing with all of the plans that we have been having in the sector. And the reason that urgency is relevant at the moment is at the center of your question of saying why agriculture now. It's because it's not yet at potential. We still think that it can grow. There's a whole range of land that can still be planted and assist us in the growth of this sector. But you know what? I'll ask Prof to just walk us through the key themes that are essential for this growth.
Yeah, maybe Wandile, to address the question more directly is, I think you're one of the optimists in the sector, and you've been beaming the progress that the sector has made across 30 years since the dawn of democracy. So that illustrates that there is a potential for the sector to do something and do substantive good for our country in terms of employment in rural areas, in terms of export revenue, and in terms of food security. So that's why the sector as such is important for the country's future and the country's health. And what we argue then in the book is to say that we think the potential is far underplayed. And it's far underplayed in the context that we have not been fully inclusive and we've not fully explored all the potential in the export market, and we've not fully utilized agriculture to its fullest potential. And the argument behind that is that there are many things that we do as a sector and what government is also doing as the enablers for the sector that they are not doing properly. And we then go into the book in terms of illustrating how black farmers are battling to enter the sector because of stupid things we do. Things that government is saying they're doing, but they're not doing. There are things that we do as a sector. We are fragmented as a sector with commodity organizations and organized agriculture separated across racial and religious lines and tribal lines, which then in essence make it very difficult for us to move forward as a sector and actually to fully utilize the sector as such. And then we go into details in terms of the regulatory dimensions and the task of government that they failed over the last 30 years. And as Wandile said, we've made lots of plans, but we never translate those plans into concrete actions and concrete results. We, in a way, are not taking the inherent potential forward, and we are making things unnecessarily difficult, unnecessarily complicated, and therefore we are failing as a collective. There's blame on government side, but there's also blame on the industry side. And therefore, when you start talking about important policy issues, eventually it ends up in politics. It's not real, critical, down-to-earth, simple issues that we need to address because people try to complicate matters. And that's why the book tries to say, but let's deal with the truth. Let's deal with the real issues so that you can actually pinpoint the actions that need to be done. And there are actions on land reform, there are actions on agricultural finance, there's actions on animal biosecurity, the actions on agricultural product standards.
At the core of it, it really comes together on the third chapter that deals with the political economy of South African farming. It's exactly on these points that Prof is relying on. I mean, there's this general understanding in South Africa that we are not implementing any of the plans that we have been creating for some time. But the question we never ask is, why are those plans not being implemented? And in a way or other, it comes together, at least in the sectoral perspective, to partly these politics, whereby, take for example, we have what we call the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan, or even Chapter 6 of the National Development Plan in South Africa, which focused on agriculture. And you realize that we implement some of these half-heartedly and others not. And we spend a lot of time on discussion, almost 3 years or more, back and forth about these plans. And before you know, the administration changes, there's a new minister, and the new minister comes up with another plan, and we are ever held up into this thing. The key idea then now, which goes back to Prof's point about the collective responsibility, but also the urgency to do what is back to basic and what would enable growth and inclusion. And that doesn't require any of these other dimensions of politics that we typically introduce.
So, what do you regard as the top priorities for overcoming those constraints?
Let's start with land, because land brings into play agriculture, then finance is to activate agriculture, and then support services to promote agriculture, and then regulations to control agriculture. So if you, as a state, sit with 2.5 million hectares on your books, and you're not transferring that to individuals to do proper commercial farming, you are going to have people occupying that land or invading the land, and they are going to suboptimal use of the land. So the first constraint is to deal with a simple transaction, get beneficiaries onto the land according to their potential. There is a criteria in terms of the beneficiary selection policy. Get them financed through the land bank and the blended finance system. Remove those constraints that are currently in place in terms of the funding of the land bank, because the land bank has too expensive funding, and therefore the money that they on lend to farmers is too expensive. The blended finance from government helps a lot to reduce the cost of funding, but still it can be much cheaper and be much more of an enabler. So those are immediately two constraints. And then thirdly, if the farmers are on the land, you need to think about how you support them in terms of farm infrastructure, general support services. And there, the model of the CASP program, the Comprehensive Agriculture Support Program, is so bureaucratically heavy that by the time the application is approved, the season has lapsed, then you have to start all over again. So a simple program would be, if you want to set up a fence, if you want to set up a new silo or new pig stall, you need to build it with finance and then apply for the grant that supports that. And then they come and inspect you, and they give you a payment for what you've incurred as a way of subsidizing that on-farm infrastructure.
What I would add here is that all of these aspects that Prof is alluding to are not things that South Africa hasn't done in the past. As complicated our history as a country as it is, I do think that there's a lot of things that we need not to ignore. In the 1930s, 40s, there's a lot of these things that were done. It's really about looking back into the history of South Africa and saying, what are some of the lessons that are relevant to today? And then leaning and taking those, working with the co-ops for the relevant environment. The other aspect I want to underscore is on Prof's first point about that 2.5 million hectares of land. You know, many people, Prof, don't picture instantly how big a 2.5 million hectares of land. But I think the better way maybe of illustrating is thinking about all of the grains and the oilseeds that South Africa produces in summer rainfall area. We produce them in about 4.5 million hectares. Now, if you have a 2.5 that could come into production, of course, not all of it is for grain, it's for different things, livestock, fruits, vegetables, and other crops. But the point is that it's quite sizable and it can change the dynamics, which is why our friends at BFEP, the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, they've made the point that if that land, we can apply what Prof was referring to, carefully selected and appropriately selected beneficiaries, bring in the skills that are needed, pair it with blended finance, agribusinesses and the others offering the support that is essential. We could even see the gross value added of agriculture expanding by plus 30%. Then finally, the jobs that Prof himself and the late great Professor Karan used to talk about, 1 million jobs in agriculture and its value chain. We may come closer to those numbers that they were talking about. But people can't walk around and asking where are the 1 million jobs in agriculture, why there were prerequisites of what needed to be done.
Yeah.
And those prerequisites is one that this book attempts to speak on and said we must unlock. There's one thing, though, that, Prof, I think it's fundamental that we mention. It's municipalities and the local government.
Oh, yeah.
Because the roads and the management of the municipalities, maintenance of the infrastructure, support services that they should be offering is something that they are failing on. And Prof makes a story that we follow certain black farmers, and I'm going to ask him to tell you a story of how we drove around when we were in the process of a research of a book, because we didn't just sit down and pull data and start writing. We went around in the Western Cape, in the Karoo parts of Gauteng, talking to farmers and seeing, and we were experiencing some of these road and the disparities provinces by provinces that needs to be implemented. Maybe, Prof, you can speak on that, on what we saw in various areas.
Yeah. It was interesting when we crossed from Western Cape to Northern Cape. The quality of the roads differ between provinces, and it's just because of managerial dimensions that are in play here, and you can see it visibly. Pre-state, where farmers say that an input supplier is not going to come to the farm anymore because their trucks will break. Nobody will come and get the cattle to take them to the abattoir because their trucks will break. So, per definition, when the infrastructure collapses, the market collapses because access to the market depends on your infrastructure. And this is a basic lesson that municipalities and our provinces sometimes fail to understand. The issues of who's in the job and who's in the province and who takes the tender is much more important than ensuring that your task to remove the constraints for your entrepreneurs in all rural areas are totally ignored is quite frightening, and this is why our downfall of the future of agriculture in many parts of South Africa is happening. But I wanted to talk about the issues of the land and the 2.5 million. And in the book, we highlight the study that was done by the Agricultural Research Council, where they show how many of those farms that the state bought is unproductive or suboptimally utilized. Only 1/3 of the farmers on the land that are currently renting from the state do have a productive, financially sustainable enterprise. The rest is either vandalized or they are suboptimal, battle to get finance. People sell the kraals and the fences to make money and so on. So the infrastructure gets stolen and depleted over time.
I think it's important, Prof, we underscore that point and even add that the challenge on it is not so much that the guys can't farm, but the issue of it again goes back to the incentive to take care of the environment that you are in, which is linked to the state's failure to firstly select the right beneficiary, thereafter pass on the title deeds that are necessary for people then to start caring for the environment, and thereafter receive the support that they are in. It has to be appropriately selected people who will then take care of that. Otherwise, this system that we have perpetuates this idea that the other farmers don't know how to farm and all of these things. And I think it is at the heart of our failure to execute what is necessary by we, I mean collectively as South Africa.
In agriculture economics, we have the standard saying that it's only the rich that can farm without finance. And that's 1% of farmers. But the majority of farmers need to have access to finance to translate the land, the fruit trees, the animals into cash. Without finance, it's not possible. But finance requires security of tenure,
Yes.
collateral. And if you don't transfer the title deed to the individual, they can't apply for finance at Land Bank or ABSA or First National Bank, whatever. So therefore, they can't generate the revenue because they need to have inputs to generate the revenue. And they need to have finance to buy the inputs. So you set them up for failure. because the security of tenure is not in place, and therefore the finance is not in place, and they all suffer as a result. And the first option is to sell the assets on the farm.
Talking about finances, Johann, earlier on you touched on the land bank funding. So how can the mistakes of that funding be rectified?
Okay, and I think Wandile mentioned the history earlier, and if you go back to history, because the land bank was established in 1912, and for the first 80 years of its existence, the state made a major contribution to the capitalization of the land bank, and whereby, because a bank borrows money from somewhere to lend to somebody, and if they have to borrow at very expensive rates, like from other commercial banks, as currently is the case, they put a margin in for the cost, and then you on lend very expensively. But in those years, the state provided the capital, and they sold land bank bonds. In Afrikaans was landbank obligasies, they used to call it. And they were priced at very low prices. And on top of that, there was a parliamentary grant coming in at zero. So the cost of funding for the bank was very low, and they could on-lend to white commercial farmers at far below the commercial bank rates. So the whole white commercial agriculture benefited from patient, affordable, and sometimes even cheap capital. That's how commercial agriculture was established over a period of 80 years. Then we changed the Land Bank Act in 2002, and then within 5 years, all the capital reserves that were built up over decades vanished. The Land Bank was basically bankrupt in 2008 with the financial crisis. Treasury had to step in, recapitalize the bank, but since then the bank was borrowing on the money market at commercial rates and on-lend to black farmers at rates far above commercial bank rates. So we have made terrible mistakes in terms of providing the patient and affordable finance to empower black farmers in the same way we established white commercial agriculture since 1920s, 1930s.
Which then means that we have made mistakes on the land, and we have made mistakes on the support system and the finance. Had we just gone back to say, how did we establish the white commercial farmers that we have in South Africa? Can we take that model, especially the support system, go to the land that we already have and see if we can execute it there? Then we begin imagining other things. But the crisis of today, Prof, instead of us releasing the land with title deeds, pairing with this support, there's always this itch to come up with another policy that will keep us in a discussion again for another 4 years while black farmers languish on the side. And I think it's these things that we need to avoid, which the book speaks of, saying we need to avoid these mistakes.
And earlier on, you spoke about municipal failures having an impact on agricultural and agro-processing sector. In what way does those failures have a negative impact on the sector?
Look, the government officials have to assist, just like any other official that is in private sector, on the goal of driving growth and assisting farmers in South Africa and the growth in rural economy. Because if we don't do this, the dilemma that we are stuck with is that in rural South Africa, there are very few industries that can do well and keep these towns viable. It's agriculture and its value chain and all of the associated businesses that come in. Then it may be mining, it may be tourism, very few other things, but you can't mine everywhere. You can't have tourism everywhere. And tourism suffers if there is no infrastructure, as agriculture suffers, which is why then having the proper infrastructure, the clean town, that is properly managed, not only assist on that, it also assists on agritourism and the broader tourism in general. And that's, to us, the challenge that it is in. But more directly to businesses, it has a lot to do with the transaction costs that it brings to businesses. Prof made an example of farmers that can collect things from the co-op, or they're having to take longer routes, or they are losing even the wear and tear, there are cars and trucks and all of these things. There are all of these minor aspects. I mean, the clear example of this is when Clover told us that they were leaving Lichtenburg because of town and municipalities that are not doing their part. I come from the Eastern Cape. We have very many difficulties, which I have discussed with the Premier and wrote about them, which needs to be done. And I hope that the Premier of the Eastern Cape gets to read the book and see the Eastern Cape also in those pages as to what can happen there. Because in his speeches, he talks optimistically about where the agricultural sector could do in the province. And I support him in that vision. But the core thing then is about implementing and making sure then that the municipalities do their part in the midst of that. But it's really the transaction cost and also making sure that the towns are attractive for investments. Because if every now and then you hear that in Lekwa municipalities there's no water, roads, and all of these things, it's very difficult to see money coming into the sector. But beyond that, it's about now the individuals that are working in the sector really doing their part and rooting out of corruption, which also continue to be a challenge in South Africa across business and in government.
Just to add on to this, this is another illustration of constraints that lead to agriculture not achieving its fullest potential. And that is why we argue that we don't have to have a plan for this. You just need an active mayor, a solid municipal manager, and fewer staff and more money for roads. Every municipality should have a qualified engineer, a qualified chartered accountant, then you won't have any of these troubles that we're having. And implicitly, it's not only the potential of agriculture that is impacted of, but if you think that poultry company Astral that had to invest in water purification plants, electricity generation, just to keep their factory afloat because the municipality couldn't do. They spent, I think the figure was something like R1 billion a year on that. And what do you think, where are they going to get that cost from? They have to inflate their price. So consumers at the end are paying. The poor consumers who eat chicken are paying for the mistakes of a municipality. So this is a crime against humanity, one can almost say. And therefore the fact that nobody is accountable for that poor circumstances and poor delivery of services is really scary. So I think this is why we need to think about how the Municipal Finance Management Act should be reformed, to see what the role is between province, district municipalities, and local municipalities. Sometimes I wonder whether we need district municipalities because they duplicate effort. Everybody plans for a local economic development plan, and then they overlap, and then there's no coordination, there's no accountability. So the constraints on agriculture's potential is just massive, and it's created by poor governance at the local level.
But our book is not a list of complaints. We come up with what to do about it. Either it's biosecurity, which, by the way, as we are talking in June 2025, it's a big thing in South Africa. And biosecurity in terms of foot and mouth disease here, but also diseases of other people, avian influenza in Brazil, as well as what it can do for South Africa in terms of the imports of poultry and all of these things. The book highlights where the problems are, but then it addresses to say to deal with our animal diseases. These are things we put in place to deal with the municipality failures. These are considerations on policy and on private sector consideration on land. This is the potential, but to get through the hurdle, these are the policy consideration and the programs that to consider for business. So it's really an attempt to contribute on building this inclusive farming economy, which is why then we went at length on clarifying so that the reader can be persuaded also through the solutions that we are putting in place. But you know what? The key thing of it, we are not trying to lecture to South Africans. We're very careful. We hope that the readers will try at least to enjoy what we were attempting to do, because we have utilized stories of individuals. The book on itself opens in the Karoo, where it gives you a flavor of this particular farmer, Enoch, that is farming in the Karoo, and the dilemmas that he faces in a government-owned farms, which then links some of these problems that we are talking about, so that the reader can actually be able to place themselves in these situations.
Also, what did you find were the reasons for lack of unity in organized agriculture, and what were the causes of those divisions of farmer organizations?
I think we briefly talked about it in the beginning when we said that that's one of the reasons for our not achieving the full potential of agriculture is that we spend time designing plans because people are unhappy, and because they're unhappy, they create another organization. So we have splinter organizations. Sometimes it is a result of a slight difference in opinion. Sometimes it's a result of ego. Sometimes it's money. And there are many organizations that are formed behind money that the state unnecessarily gave to the organizations. So you see in amongst white commercial farmers, there are probably 4 organizations. Amongst black commercial farmers, there are about 10, sometimes by commodity, sometimes by grouping. So it confuses the whole landscape, and then everybody demands that the state should pay them. And then when they come into a meeting to plan or to work together for solutions, everybody has contested ideas. And then eventually the minister decides, oh, you guys can't agree, so then I'm just going to do what I want to do. So it's not an industry-wide solution. So it is divide and rule type of reality that we have in the industry. We highlight that we don't really understand why these things are happening. For many years, at least, I've made the argument that we should have a United Farmers Association of South Africa. And I'll make that call at the end of the day to say, get rid of this tribalism, this racialism, and this religious categories of farmers, and think about farmer is a farmer that has the same problem everywhere. And therefore, you need to speak with one voice.
Johann Kutsie, the CEO of AgriSA, would appreciate that message because he says he represents agriculture, South Africa, not only just AgriSA as we know it.
Yeah.
But I think, the core issue here is also the idea that this fragmentation creates an incentive for doing nothing. Because now, if I am a regulator and I want to bring in a particular vaccine, and you have all of these farmer associations, others agreeing, others not agreeing, you end up now having a more stronger incentive to go with the ones that agree with you. And thereafter, you are threatened to be taken into courts and all kinds of things by the others that do not agree with. But it's also not always clear to me how many people actually spend a lot of time thinking about the aspects that they then hold views on. So these are difficult environment on the farmer association, especially as they become thin and many, and then the resource constraint even internally to devote into working on some of these policy questions that the farmers will be. The idea, which is what then Prof proposes here, which is something we contain in the book, is that if you have a bigger grouping representing a wider grouping of farmers, then you have a staff complement there that could think clinically about these things and looking at data and looking for the welfare of the farming sector, so that when they propose a policy position, there's really a clear consideration that people have thought through about what are the medium and the long-term consequences of the policy. But at this moment, there are some that are very thin on the resource side and the human capital, where you don't always know how much we are arguing the country should be committed on a particular idea. Perhaps maybe we haven't explored that path that we are proposing sufficiently enough.
And finally, what kind of cooperation is needed between government, business, and civil society to move the country's agricultural sector forward?
What I think we need to gravitate with is that if I'm sitting in Hong Kong and I'm buying stuff, it's unclear to me how many people think as to whether they are importing peaches from black farmers or white farmers. When it lands there, at least to my mind, I think it lands as a South Africa Inc. product. So the politics of the sector and the conversations we allow to surface and the image of the sector is something that worries me a lot of late, especially because this is a sector that is export oriented. Much of this growth that Prof and I are talking about, which is why when you read, we're not only talking about municipalities, but we also talk about the ports, the railway line, and all of these things. Because once all of this is produced, it will be for the export markets, because we're already sending nearly half of what we produce to the export. There's not a lot of capacity domestically to absorb this. Take, for example, in citrus, In the citrus we produce, 80% of it or so goes to export markets, as an example. So when you expand, you'll be expanding for export, but then that means the image of agriculture, cooperation, and making sure that we're building South Africa Inc. agricultural products is something that the politics and the difficulties will need to consider. But all of this comes back then to this point that we have one interest as a sector, because ultimately, if you are dealing with land reform, for example, land reform in my mind has to address two things: restorative justice and economic growth. Because the problems of South Africa is poverty, low growth, and unemployment. So whatever we do, it has to be towards addressing those particular aspects. And which is why Prof and I studied this subject, is because we are saying, okay, what can be done for agriculture to help on resolving the triple challenges of South Africa: unemployment, poverty, and hunger, and then addressing these constraints that we are talking about, either at the political economy side, at the municipality, at the land, or otherwise, is an effort and an attempt to actually have a positive spin-off towards resolving these problems. That's the core, perhaps maybe the motivation on why Prof and I devoted time to write The Uncomfortable Truth about South Africa's agriculture.
That was Wandile Sihlobo and Johann Kirsten speaking to Creamer Media's Polity on the uncomfortable truth about South Africa's agriculture.